People don't move to small towns because they're sleepy anymore. They move because the math works. And when the math works, charm suddenly becomes a bonus instead of the reason. The American relocation story right now isn't about escaping cities out of fear or chasing some Hallmark fantasy. It's about recalibrating cost, lifestyle, and leverage at the same time. Remote work cracked geography wide open. Mortgage rates exposed who was overextended. And rising metro housing costs forced a quiet question into millions of households. If you can earn from anywhere, why stay where everything costs more? That question is reshaping towns that 5 years ago barely registered on national migration maps. But here's the tension nobody wants to admit. Every time a small town becomes the next place, it stops being what made it attractive in the first place. This isn't a sentimental movement, it's strategic. And the first town on this list shows exactly how subtle that shift can be before it becomes irreversible. Traverse City, Michigan, the lake town that became a spreadsheet decision. On the surface, Traverse City looks like a vacation brochure, cherry orchards, freshwater beaches along Lake Michigan, sailboats cutting through Grand Traverse Bay. The permanent population is just under 16,000, but the larger Grand Traverse County population has grown steadily, rising more than 9% between 2010 and 2020, with continued inbound movement through 2023. That growth isn't explosive, but it's consistent, and consistency changes housing markets quietly before headlines catch up. Median home values, which once hovered comfortably below national averages, climbed sharply during the post-2020 housing surge, reaching roughly $400,000, $450,000 by 2024, depending on neighborhood. For longtime residents who purchased homes in the early 2000s, that appreciation created unexpected equity gains. For younger buyers or service workers, it created friction. Tourism has always powered Traverse City's economy. Wineries, the National Cherry Festival, summer lake traffic, but recent years introduced a new variable. Remote professionals relocating from Chicago, Detroit, and even farther out, bringing salaries detached from the local wage base. That's where the real shift lives. When income streams no longer match local employment conditions, housing prices stop reflecting the town's internal economy and start reflecting national demand. You feel it in subtle ways. Rental listings disappear faster. Starter homes attract multiple offers. Restaurants struggle to hire because employees can't find affordable leases within city limits. The town still feels relaxed, but the financial undercurrent is moving faster than the sailboats. And, emotionally, that creates dual narratives. Newcomers talk about quality of life, walkable downtown, freshwater sunsets, a calmer pace. Longtime locals talk about property taxes rising with assessments, about friends moving 20 minutes inland for affordability, about summer crowds lasting longer into the fall. It's not hostility. It's adjustment. Traverse City proves that you don't need mountains or dramatic skylines to become a relocation magnet. You just need natural beauty plus relative affordability compared to major metros. But relative affordability has an expiration date once national buyers notice. Greenville, South Carolina, the reinvention that attracted a wave. Greenville used to be shorthand for textile mills and quiet southern industry. Today, it's shorthand for transformation. Between 2010 and 2020, Greenville County grew by roughly 10%, and the city itself has continued gaining residents into 2023. Median home values that once sat below $200,000 in the mid-2010s climbed into the mid-$300s, 0S and beyond by 2024. That kind of appreciation isn't random, it follows investment. Downtown Greenville underwent significant revitalization over the past 2 decades, turning its main street into a walkable corridor lined with restaurants, small businesses, and green spaces anchored by Falls Park on the Reedy. Add in a business climate that attracted manufacturers
When
and
people
corporate
talk about
offices,
West Virginia,
and you get
they
job
usually
growth
talk about it
layered
like
onto
it's
aesthetic
one
appeal.
single
But
housing
the
market.
post-2020
Like every town is moving in the
chapter
same direction.
accelerated
And that's
everything.
honestly the biggest
As
mistake you
remote
can
work
make when trying
loosened
to understand what's
geographic
actually
ties,
happening here.
buyers
Because
from
West
higher
Virginia
cost
right now
states
is
began
splitting into
arriving,
2 very
often
different
selling
realities at the
properties
same
at far
time.
higher
And if you
valuations
don't
and
understand
entering
why some
Greenville's
towns are
market with
quietly
strong
rising
down
while
payments,
others are slowly
that
fading,
creates
you're going
leverage.
to
And
completely
leverage
misread the
changes pricing
opportunity.
psychology.
Here's the
Homes that
truth.
once lingered on the
West
market
Virginia
now
isn't
moved
dying
quickly.
as a whole,
Developers
but it also
expanded
isn't
outward.
booming as a whole
Infrastructure
either.
conversations
What's really
intensified.
happening is that
Living
certain
in
towns
Greenville
are
now
absorbing starving
feels like
demand,
living
while
inside a
others are
city
bleeding it out.
that's trying
And the
to
reasons
hold
have
on to
nothing
its
to do
southern
with hype
gentleness
and everything
while
to do with
absorbing
fundamentals
metropolitan
people don't
ambition.
like to talk
The
about.
humor is subtle but
The
real.
first big
People move
divider
to
is
slow
jobs.
down
Not
and bring
just jobs
fast-paced
exist
expectations
versus
with them.
jobs
Higher
don't,
end dining,
but the type of
expanded
jobs and
entertainment
how stable
options,
they
more
are.
development.
Towns
The
that
tension
still
isn't
rely
political,
heavily on a
it's
single
structural.
declining
When
industry
growth
tend to struggle no
outpaces
matter how
long-term
cheap the
planning
homes
cycles,
get,
roads
because
feel
cheap
more
houses
crowded.
don't matter if there's no
Schools need
long-term
expansion.
income to
Housing
support them.
inventory tightens.
On the
Yet
other hand,
Greenville's appeal
towns that have
persists
managed to
because
diversify
compared to
even
many
a little
coastal cities,
healthcare,
it still
education,
feels attainable.
logistics,
Property
regional
taxes
services,
remain
or
moderate
remote-friendly
relative to some
employment are
northern
quietly
states.
pulling
The
ahead,
downtown core
not
feels
exploding
curated,
overnight,
but not
but staying
overwhelming.
alive and
For many
slowly gaining
families,
ground
that
while others
balanced
stall.
opportunity
The
without
second
mega
divider
city
is
scale
accessibility,
feels like a
and
sweet
this
spot.
one is
The
huge.
emotional layer here
Towns that are
is
closer to
optimism
highways,
mixed with
interstates,
caution.
regional
New
airports,
residents
or even
speak
just
about
positioned as
opportunity
connectors
and
between
upward
larger metro
mobility.
areas tend to
Some
hold
long-term
value better
residents
and
speak about
recover faster.
identity and whether
Because
growth
people
changes
don't
the
want
character that
isolation
made the city
anymore.
appealing
They
in the
want
first place.
affordability without cutting
Greenville
themselves
illustrates how
off from the rest
reinvention
of the
can attract
world.
migration,
A town can
but
be
also how
beautiful,
migration
cheap,
tests
and
reinvention's
peaceful.
limits.
But if it's an
Across both
hour away
towns,
from
a pattern
basic services
emerges.
or
Steady
reliable
growth that
infrastructure,
turns into
demand
acceleration
eventually
once
dries
national
up,
housing disparities
especially
widen.
for younger
Traverse
buyers
City
and
shows how
families.
natural beauty and moderate
Meanwhile,
pricing
towns
draw
that sit
remote
just close
professionals.
enough to bigger economic
Greenville
centers
shows how
benefit
urban
from spillover
revitalization
demand.
paired
People
with
who are
business
priced out
expansion
elsewhere but
attracts
still
both
want access to
and
jobs,
relocation
healthcare,
capital.
and
Neither town
services
experienced
without paying
overnight
big city
explosions.
prices.
They
The third
experienced
factor
sustained
most people
interest that
ignore is
compounded
population
over time.
behavior,
That
not
compounding is
population
what
size.
matters. It
It's not
quietly
just about whether
recalibrates
people are
affordability
moving in
thresholds,
or out,
reshapes
it's
rental
who is
markets,
moving.
and shifts local
Towns that
income
are attracting
dynamics.
retirees,
Be
remote
honest, if you
workers,
could
or
lower your
small
housing
families
costs compared
tend
to
to
a larger
stabilize
metro
because
while
these
gaining
groups bring
walkability,
consistent income,
safety,
lower
and aesthetic
volatility,
appeal,
and
wouldn't
long-term
you at
housing
least
demand.
consider it? That's
Towns
the internal
losing
monologue
younger
driving
residents
this wave.
without
But
replacing
here's
them
the
with
part
any
nobody
inbound population
advertises.
slowly
Every
hollow
arrival
out,
slightly
even if
tightens
prices
the
look
next
cheap on
arrival's
paper.
options.
Cheap
Inventory
doesn't mean
shrinks,
healthy. It
prices
often
climb,
means trapped.
expectations shift.
Another massive
And what
difference
once
maker
felt
is
like a
housing
hidden
stock
gem
itself.
becomes a known
Towns with a mix of
quantity.
older homes
That
and newer or
transformation
renovated
doesn't happen
inventory
with
give buyers
fireworks.
options, and
It
that
happens
flexibility
with
keeps
appraisal
markets
reports
alive.
and census
In
updates.
contrast,
And
towns
as we move
dominated by
up this
outdated
list,
housing
the
that
towns
hasn't
don't
been
just grow
maintained
steadily, they
become harder
surge,
to
they
revive
stretch their
because buyers
infrastructure,
factor
and they begin
renovation
facing the
costs
harder
into
question.
already limited
How
budgets.
much growth is
And
too
suddenly,
much before
that cheap
beauty
house
becomes
doesn't
branding
look cheap
instead
at
of
all.
reality? That's where this
Rising
migration
towns
story
tend to have
starts
at least
getting
some
uncomfortable,
reinvestment
and that's
happening.
exactly where we're
Small
heading next.
renovations,
The
updated
migration
rentals,
narrative gets
basic
more
improvements,
uncomfortable the moment
while
you
dying
realize it
towns
isn't
often
limited
freeze in
to quiet
time,
lakeside
waiting for a
towns or
miracle that
revitalized
never
southern
shows up.
cities. It's reaching
Schools
places that
also
built
play
their
a much
identity
bigger
on
role than people
exclusivity
admit.
and natural
Even buyers
drama,
without kids
and
pay
now
attention to
they're
school
wrestling with
quality
scale.
because it
The
affects
second layer
resale
of the
value,
story
rental
isn't
demand,
about steady
and
growth.
long-term
It's
stability.
about acceleration
Towns with
that
stable
changes
or
the
improving school
psychological temperature
systems
of a
tend to
town.
hold value better,
Because when
while
population
towns
gains
with
collide with
declining
limited
enrollment and
geography, the
underfunded
math
schools
tightens
often
fast.
struggle to
And that's
attract
where
new
the next two
residents,
towns
no
on
matter
this
how
list
affordable they
sit
are.
beautiful,
Healthcare
yes,
access is
but
another
also
quiet
strained.
divider.
Kalispell,
Towns near
Montana, when
hospitals,
proximity
clinics, or
becomes a
regional medical
catalyst.
centers tend to
Kalispell
attract
isn't
older
always the
residents and
first name
families
people
alike,
mention when talking
while
about
towns
Montana
losing
migration.
healthcare
That
access
spotlight
lose
often
population
goes
fast,
elsewhere, but the
especially
data
as
tells
residents
its own
age.
story.
Then
Clagett
there's
County
perception,
experienced
and
substantial
perception
growth
matters
during the
more than people
2010s,
think.
increasing
Some
by more
towns
than
are actively
14%
rebranding
between
themselves without
2010
saying it out
and
loud.
2020.
They
With
invest in
continued
walkable
in-migration
downtowns,
through
basic amenities,
2023.
local businesses,
Kalispell
and outdoor
itself,
access,
with a
which
population
changes how people
surpassing
feel about living
26,000
there.
inches, recent
Other
census
towns stay
estimates,
stuck in
has
survival
expanded
mode,
steadily,
doing nothing to
absorbing
attract
spillover from
newcomers,
surrounding
and over time,
high-amenity
that
areas
lack of
near
momentum
Glacier
becomes
National
visible.
Park.
Even
Median
small
home
things
values
like
that once
broadband
hovered below
access make a massive difference now.
$250,000 in the
Towns with reliable
mid-2010s
internet
surged
quietly benefit from
dramatically
remote
during the
work trends, while towns without it
post-2020
fall
housing
further
run-up,
behind, regardless of how low prices go.
$500,000 in
The
recent
final
market
piece most
cycles
people miss
before
is
moderating
timing.
slightly with
Rising
broader
towns
national
often
trends.
benefit from
That
being
kind
just
of
early
appreciation
enough.
isn't
They're not
cosmetic.
overcrowded,
It
not
alters who can
overpriced,
buy,
and
who
not
must
fully
rent,
discovered
and
yet.
who quietly
Dying
relocates
towns
farther
tend to
from the
miss
core.
timing
The
windows.
draw is
Either they
obvious.
peaked earlier
Mountain
and
views,
declined,
proximity
or
to
they never
national park
adapted when
access,
economic shifts
year-round
happened.
outdoor recreation,
None of this
and a
happens
perception of
overnight,
lower
and
taxes
that's why
compared to
people get
coastal states.
confused.
But
Prices don't
perception
crash
doesn't always
instantly,
account for
and
wage
growth
gaps.
doesn't explode
Median
instantly
household
either.
incomes in the region have
Instead,
risen,
you see
but
slow,
not at
steady
the pace of home
divergence.
value growth
One
during
town
peak
gets a
years.
little more demand
That
every
creates
year.
a compression
Another
effect
loses a
where
little more
income and remote
relevance every
earners with
year.
external
Over
salaries
time,
compete
that
in the
gap
same
becomes
housing
massive.
pool as locals working
And this is
within
why
the regional
blanket
economy.
headlines about West
The lived
Virginia being
experience
cheap or
shifts in
expensive,
subtle
booming
increments.
or collapsing,
Rental
completely
listings
miss the
disappear
point.
more quickly.
The real story
New
isn't the
subdivisions
state,
appear on
it's the
previously open
town-by-town
land.
battle
Traffic
between
at trailheads
adaptation and
increases,
stagnation.
and conversations Patrons at local
Some
diners
places
turn
are
toward
quietly
property
positioning
assessments and
themselves
school
for the next
capacity.
decade,
Kalispell
while others are
illustrates a
slowly
key
being left
migration
behind.
truth. When a
Not because
nearby
they're
town
bad
becomes
places,
expensive,
but because
its
the
neighbor
world
becomes the
moved
pressure
and they
valve
didn't
until
move
it
with
isn't.
it. And
What
once you
once felt like a
understand
more
why that
affordable
split is
alternative
happening,
begins
you start
following the
seeing
same
West Virginia
trajectory.
not as a
The
risky
irony
market,
is sharp.
but as one of the
People
clearest
move for space and
examples of how
quiet,
local
then find
fundamentals
themselves
decide
debating zoning
everything.
density at town halls.
What really accelerates the
Yet the
divide
flow
between
continues
rising and dying
because,
towns in
compared
West
to
Virginia
major
is that the
West Coast
forces
metros,
shaping them are no
even
longer
elevated
temporary or
Montana
cyclical.
prices can
They're
still
structural.
look like a
And once
bargain.
structural shifts take
And when
hold,
buyers arrive
markets
with equity
don't naturally
from
bounce back without
$900,000
deliberate
or
change.
$1
One of the
million
biggest
homes
drivers
elsewhere,
here is how
$500,000
affordability actually
listings
works
feel
in
manageable.
practice
That's
versus how
leverage in
people
action.
assume it works.
Kalispell is
In
no longer
theory,
just a gateway
cheaper
town.
housing should
It's
attract
a
demand,
recalculation
but in
point.
reality,
Prescott,
affordability
Arizona.
only
Elevation
matters
as an
when
escape
paired with
strategy.
livability.
Prescott sits
Towns
at
that are
roughly
rising tend to offer a full
5,300
life
feet
at
in
a lower
elevation,
cost,
offering cooler
not just cheap
temperatures than
homes,
Phoenix,
but
while
manageable
remaining within
utilities,
driving distance
accessible
of major
groceries,
Arizona metros.
reasonable commutes,
The
and
city's
services that
population
don't require
surpassed
constant travel.
47,000
In
recent
contrast,
estimates.
towns that are dying
Yavapai
often
County
have
has
low
seen
home
steady
prices
growth
but high
across
friction
the last
costs,
decade.
meaning residents
From
spend more
2010 to
time,
2020,
money, and
the county
energy
grew
just
by
functioning
over
day to day.
13%,
Over time,
reflecting
people
sustained
choose slightly
in-migration
higher housing
patterns.
costs if it
Median
means
home
less
values
daily
in
stress,
Prescott,
and that
which once
decision
hovered
drains
in the
demand from
mid-$200s,
places that can't offer
0s
convenience.
in the mid-2010s,
Another major factor
climbed
is
toward
ownership
and
behavior.
beyond $500,000
In rising towns,
in
you'll
the
often
years
see a
following
higher percentage of
2020's
owner
housing
occupants
surge.
who plan to
That
stay
jump
long-term,
wasn't
which
isolated.
creates stability and
Arizona
community
consistently
investment.
ranked among
These
states
owners
with strong
maintain
inbound
properties,
migration
improve
during
them
peak
gradually,
relocation
and care
years.
about neighborhood
The
outcomes.
appeal is layered.
In struggling
You get
towns,
pine forests
ownership
instead of
shifts
desert
toward
heat,
absentee
a
owners,
historic downtown
distressed
with
sellers,
preserved Western
or short-term
architecture,
holders,
and
which
property
leads to
tax
deferred
rates that
maintenance,
remain moderate
declining
relative
housing
to several
quality,
high-tax
and
coastal
weaker
states.
appeal to new
But
buyers.
here's the structural
That change
twist.
doesn't show up immediately
Prescott's
in
growth
prices,
isn't driven
but it shows
solely
up
by
clearly in
retirees,
how towns
as
feel,
older demographic
and buyers
narratives might
absolutely
suggest.
respond to
Remote
that feeling.
professionals seeking
Local
milder
government
climate
capacity
and lower
also plays a
relative
much
housing
bigger
costs
role than people
began
like to
adding
admit.
demand pressure.
Towns that are
Healthcare,
rising tend to have
education,
at least
and local
functional
government
governance,
anchor much
not
of the
perfect,
employment base.
not
Yet,
flashy,
home
but
pricing
capable of
increasingly
maintaining
reflects
basic services,
national buying
managing
power
infrastructure,
rather than purely
and
local
responding
wages.
to small
That
opportunities.
mismatch introduces
Dying
friction.
towns often
Younger
suffer from
households entering the
administrative
workforce
stagnation,
find
where
starter
limited
homes harder
budgets,
to secure.
declining tax
Builders
bases,
push
and lack of
outward,
leadership
expanding
trap them in a
development
feedback
footprints.
loop they can't
Water
easily
resource planning
escape.
becomes more complex
When basic
in a
systems stop
drought-conscious
improving,
state.
residents
while
lose
many
confidence,
residents celebrate
and once
appreciation
confidence is
gains,
gone,
they also
people stop
watch
buying,
insurance
even if
premiums
prices
and
drop
construction
further.
costs climb.
Another
The
divider is how
emotional
towns
atmosphere in
interact with
Prescott feels
external
cautiously
demand.
optimistic.
Rising
There's
towns
pride
don't
in the
rely
town's
on
charm
massive
and
inflows.
stability,
They
but also
benefit from
awareness
steady
that
trickles,
rapid appreciation
retirees
can price out
downsizing,
future
remote
generations.
workers
The
relocating,
dark humor writes
families
itself.
seeking
People
affordability,
move to
or
Prescott to
locals
avoid
choosing
the
to
intensity
stay
of
instead of
Phoenix,
leave.
then spend
That
weekends
steady flow
navigating
builds
crowded trails
resilience.
that didn't feel
Dying
crowded
towns
5
often
years
depend on a
earlier.
single hope,
Yet
one
even with
employer,
rising
one
costs,
project,
Prescott
one
remains
revival narrative,
relatively attractive
and when that
compared
doesn't
to larger
materialize,
southwestern
demand
markets.
evaporates.
That's the paradox.
The absence
Growth
of
narrows
diversification
affordability,
makes
but
recovery
doesn't erase it
fragile
entirely,
and
at least
unpredictable.
not yet.
Infrastructure
Together,
investment
Kalispell
also
and
quietly
Prescott reveal the
determines
second
outcomes.
stage of small-town
Rising
migration.
towns often sit along
Spillover
maintained
and
road
climate
networks,
arbitrage.
stable utilities,
Kalispell
and
benefits
expanding
from proximity
broadband
to
access,
high-demand mountain
which doesn't make
destinations.
headlines, but directly
Prescott
affects
benefits
quality
from
of
elevation
life.
relief within a booming
Dying
state.
towns
Both
fall
experienced
behind on
double-digit
infrastructure
county growth
upgrades,
over the
and
last
once
decade.
that gap
Both saw
forms, it
median
becomes
home
harder
values
and
climb
more
sharply
expensive
after
to close.
2020. Both
Buyers
now
might
balance
tolerate older
natural beauty
homes,
against
but they're far less
infrastructure
forgiving
strain.
about
And both
unreliable
demonstrate
water,
how
electricity,
geography
or
becomes a
connectivity.
financial strategy.
Another important
This
factor
isn't
is demographic
accidental
momentum.
relocation.
Rising
It's targeted
towns often
movement,
attract or
driven by
retain
tax
people in
structure,
different life
remote work
stages, young
flexibility,
adults,
and
families,
comparative
and
housing
older
matching.
residents, which
But
creates
as
a
we move
balanced
further
demand
up this
profile.
list, the towns
Dying
don't just
towns skew
absorb
heavily
migration,
toward
they
one age
become
group,
national
usually
headlines for
older
it.
residents,
And
which
when a town
reduces
becomes a
long-term
headline,
housing turnover
expectations
and
rise
limits
even
future
faster
demand.
than prices.
As that
That's where the
imbalance
real
grows,
tension
prices
begins to
don't
surface.
just stagnate,
Here's
they
where the
slowly
pattern
decay
stops
as
being
fewer
subtle
buyers
and
enter the
starts becoming
pipeline.
loud.
The rental
Because the
market
next
also
two
plays a
towns
role
didn't
here.
just experience steady
In stronger
growth or
towns,
spillover
rentals
migration,
remain
they
viable
became
because tenants
symbols.
want to live there,
Symbols
not just
of remote
because
work
they have no
freedom.
choice.
Symbols
That
of
keeps
you can
rental
have it
income
all,
stable
living.
and attracts
And once a town
responsible
becomes a
landlords who
symbol,
maintain
demand
properties.
doesn't trickle in.
In
It
weaker
surges.
towns,
And
rentals
surges
often
don't
become
ask
last
whether the
resort
local
housing,
supply
which
is
leads
ready.
to neglect,
Coeur d'Alene,
higher
Idaho.
vacancy, and
When
further
migration
deterioration
becomes
of housing
momentum,
stock.
Coeur d'Alene
This
sits in
dynamic
northern
pushes
Idaho
buyers
along
away
its
even when
namesake
prices
lake,
look attractive
surrounded
on
by
paper.
forested hills
Another
and mountain
overlooked
backdrops
element
that
is
look
perception
almost
lag.
staged for
Rising
marketing
towns
campaigns.
often don't feel hot
But this
yet,
isn't a
which
branding
keeps
story, it's a
expectations
migration
realistic
story
and
with numbers
competition
behind it.
manageable.
The city's
Dying
population
towns,
reached
on the other
roughly
hand, often carry outdated
56,900
reputations
inches
that
recent
continue to
census
scare off
estimates,
buyers
and
long
Kootenai
after
County
conditions
grew
have
by more than
changed. But without
20%
real
between
improvements,
2010
perception never
and
catches up.
2020,
This creates a
making it
widening
one of the
gap where one
fastest-growing
group
counties
slowly
in the Pacific
improves without
Northwest
attention,
during that
while
period.
another declines
That growth
quietly without
accelerated
intervention.
sharply after 2020,
Perhaps the most
when Idaho
important
ranked
reason the
at
divide
or near the
persists
top of
is that
inbound
markets no
migration
longer
indices
correct
nationwide.
evenly.
The housing market
In the
responded
past,
immediately.
downturns forced
Median
widespread
home values,
resets that
which
allowed
were
weaker
around
areas to rebound,
$250,000
along with
in the
stronger ones.
mid-2010s,
Today,
climbed above
capital,
$500,000
migration, and
during
attention
peak
are far more selective.
2021-2022
People don't buy cheap
activity.
anymore. They
Even
buy
with some
right.
national
And when
cooling
buyers
afterward,
become
prices
selective,
remained
places that
dramatically
don't meet
elevated
minimum
compared to
standards
pre-pandemic
don't
levels.
recover just
And
because
that's
prices
where the
fall.
lived experience
They
starts to
continue
shift.
drifting downward
Longtime
until
residents
something
saw equity
fundamental
multiply.
changes. That's why
Newcomers
some West
arrived with
Virginia
cash
towns are
offers
climbing
or
steadily,
substantial
almost
down payments
invisibly,
from higher
while
priced
others are
states.
fading despite
Rental
being more
inventory
affordable
tightened.
than ever.
Builders
The
raced
market
to keep
isn't being
pace.
unfair,
The
it's being
psychological
precise.
tone of the town
And once
changed
precision
from
replaces
regional
broad
lake
cycles,
destination
divergence
to
becomes the
national
norm,
relocation
not the
hotspot.
exception.
Walk downtown
By the time
today
most
and
people
you'll see
realize
lake
some
views
West
and
Virginia
mountain
towns
air.
are rising while
Yes,
others are
but you'll
dying.
also feel a
The
quiet
difference has
tension
already
between
been
those who
visible for
arrived with
years,
remote
in subtle
salaries
ways that
and
don't
those
show up in
working
headlines,
tourism,
but
retail,
absolutely show
and
up in
healthcare
real-life
locally.
behavior.
When
One of
external
the
income
clearest
flows
signs
into
is
a
how
contained
prices
housing
move not
market,
dramatically,
pricing
but
detaches from
directionally.
local wage growth.
In rising
That's
towns,
not
prices
ideological.
don't explode.
It's arithmetic.
They inch
Property
forward,
taxes
hold their
rise with
ground, and recover
valuations.
quickly after
Insurance
slowdowns.
costs climb
Even when sales
alongside
volume
construction
drops,
demand.
sellers
Traffic
don't
patterns
panic,
shift.
and buyers
Yet
still
the draw
exist,
remains
just more
powerful.
selective.
No state
That's
income
because
tax,
demand in these areas
abundant
is
outdoor
rooted in
access,
real use,
and
not
relative
speculation.
affordability compared to
People
coastal
are
markets.
buying to live,
The
to
dark
stay,
humor?
to settle.
People flag
In dying
congestion only
towns,
to create
prices
mini
don't
versions of
usually
it in
crash
places
either.
that
They
once
slowly
felt immune.
bleed. You
Coeur
see,
d'Alene
repeated
didn't just
price
grow,
cuts,
it
longer listing
recalibrated.
times,
And once
homes being
recalibration
taken off the
begins,
market
it
and
rarely
relisted
reverses
later,
fully.
and properties
Bozeman,
selling below
Montana,
expectations
a mountain
even
town
when
that went
sellers
national.
waited out.
If Coeur
That
d'Alene
slow erosion
represents
is far more
momentum,
dangerous than a
Bozeman
sharp
represents
drop
velocity.
because it drains
The
confidence
city's
over
population
time.
exceeded
Buyer
53,000
behavior
inches
reinforces
recent
this
estimates,
divide.
and
In
Gallatin
rising
County grew
towns,
by roughly
buyers move with
30%
intention.
between
They tour
2010
fewer
and
homes, but when they
2021,
decide,
of the
they
fastest
act.
growth rates
They're
in
not
the
rushing,
country for
but
a
they're not
county its
hesitating
size.
endlessly
But
either.
raw population growth
In declining
doesn't capture
towns,
the full impact.
buyers circle without
Median
committing,
home values
looking
that
for
once sat
deeper
near
discounts that never quite feel safe
$320,000 around
enough.
2015
That hesitation
surged
reduces transaction
dramatically,
activity,
exceeding
which further weakens the
$700,000
market's
during
signal
peak
and
housing
creates a
cycles
self-reinforcing
after 2020.
slowdown.
That's not
Another way
incremental
this split
change.
shows up
That's a
is in
structural
renovations
shift
and
in
maintenance.
who can realistically
Rising
buy.
towns see steady,
Bozeman's appeal
incremental
is
improvement,
layered.
roofs
Proximity
replaced,
to Yellowstone
kitchens
National
updated,
Park,
rentals
access to
refreshed,
skiing and hiking,
sidewalks
and
fixed,
Montana State
nothing
University
flashy,
anchoring
but
an
constant
educated
motion.
workforce.
Dying
During
towns
the
often
remote work
freeze.
expansion of
Owners stop
2020
investing
and
because they don't believe the
2021,
return is worth it,
professionals from
and that lack
California,
of reinvestment
Washington,
becomes
and
visible in
Colorado
the housing
began
stock itself.
relocating in meaningful
Buyers
numbers.
notice immediately,
Some
even if they
came
can't
permanent.
articulate why a place
Others
feels
tested
off.
the waters with
Rental
second homes
dynamics
that later
also
converted
expose
to
the divide
primary
clearly.
residences. The
In
result was
healthier
inventory
towns,
compression so
rentals stay
intense that bidding
occupied,
wars became
and rents
common.
remain stable
Local
because people
reports
actually
highlighted
want to
workforce
live there.
housing shortages,
Vacancy
and
exists,
developers
but it's
accelerated
manageable.
projects in
In
response.
struggling towns,
But
rentals
infrastructure
churn,
lags behind
tenants
demand
come and
in
go,
most mountain towns.
vacancy stretches
Roads
longer,
don't widen
and
overnight.
maintenance is deferred.
Water systems
That
don't
degrades
scale
neighborhoods
instantly.
and pushes
School districts
owner-occupant
require
buyers
planning
away,
cycles
which
that
further
migration
reduces
waves
demand.
don't respect.
Long-term
Living in
outcomes
Bozeman today
diverge
feels
even more
dynamic.
sharply.
Coffee shops filled with
Rising towns
laptops,
slowly
trailheads,
accumulate
busy
equity.
year-round, but it also feels
Homeowners
more
may not
competitive.
feel richer
The
year to
emotional
year,
undertone
but
is
over a
complex.
decade, they
Pride in
realize their
national
properties held
recognition,
value,
anxiety
costs stayed
over
manageable,
affordability,
and options
frustration
expanded.
among younger
Declining
residents watching
towns
starter
trap
homes
equity.
drift out of
Owners
reach.
find that
The
even
town
after
didn't
years
lose
of
its
ownership,
mountains. It
selling
didn't
doesn't
lose its
unlock
views.
much mobility.
But it did
That
lose
lack
the
of
pricing
mobility
insulation that
discourages
once
new
defined it.
buyers and
And that's the key
reinforces
tension.
stagnation.
Bozeman still offers
Waiting,
beauty
which many
and
people
outdoor
assume is a
access,
safe
but it
strategy,
now competes
often
on a
makes things
national
worse
housing
in these
stage
environments.
rather than a
In
regional.
rising towns,
The
waiting
sarcastic
usually
reality,
means paying
the
more
same
later
people who
or
once
losing
said,
choice.
"Don't California my Montana," Montana
In dying
ended up
towns,
competing with
waiting doesn't
California-level
magically
buying
fix
power.
fundamentals.
Together,
It often
Coeur
means
d'Alene
watching
and Bozeman
demand thin
illustrate
out
the
further
third
while
stage of
maintenance
small
costs
town
rise.
migration.
Another
Identity
behavioral
shift.
difference
Not
shows
just
up in
growth,
who exits
not
the
just
market.
spillover.
In stronger
full
towns,
reclassification
sellers
from
exit by
regional gem
choice,
to national
downsizing,
destination. That
relocating,
reclassification
upgrading.
changes
In weaker
expectations.
towns,
It
exits
attracts
are often
investment,
forced
it
or
accelerates
reluctant,
appreciation,
driven by
and it
necessity
introduces
rather than
inequality pressures
opportunity.
that smaller
That
economies
difference
struggle to
affects
buffer.
pricing
Both
psychology.
towns experience
Buyers can sense
double-digit population
desperation,
growth
even when
over the
sellers
past
try to
decade.
hide it. and they
Both
adjust
saw home
offers
prices
accordingly.
more than double
Over
within
time,
roughly
this shifts
8
market
years.
norms
Both
downward.
became relocation
There's also a
case studies,
generational
and
element at
both now
play.
walk a
Rising
tightrope
towns manage to
between
keep or
economic
attract
vitality
younger
and
residents who
housing
eventually become
sustainability.
buyers,
But here's
renovators,
the
and
uncomfortable
long-term
truth.
owners.
As
Declining
prices climb
towns
in the
lose that
towns that
pipeline,
already
which
made
means fewer
headlines,
future buyers
attention
regardless
shifts
of
to the
how
next
cheap
tier,
homes get.
the towns
Without
that still
generational
feel
turnover,
early.
markets
And
don't
that's where the
revive,
next segment
they
takes
shrink.
us.
Another
Because
critical
what happens
signal is
when
how
migration
lenders
pressure
behave.
hits places
In
that
healthier
were never
areas,
designed for
financing remains
national
available
demand?
and
Here's where the
straightforward
story
because
stops
risk
being
feels
about famous
manageable.
mountain magnets
In
and
weaker
starts
areas,
being about
lending
places that
becomes
never
more
expected
conservative.
national attention in the first
Appraisals
place.
come in lower,
Because
and
once the
deals fall
headline
apart
towns
more
surge,
often,
buyers don't
which
disappear.
discourages
They
buyers
pivot.
further.
They start looking for
All
the
of
next
this
Bozeman,
creates
the
two
next
very
Coeur
different
d'Alene, the
timelines.
town that still
In
feels
rising
early.
towns, 5
And
years
that's
can
when
quietly
migration pressure
transform a
hits
market
communities
from
that were built for
overlooked to
regional life,
competitive.
not
In
national
dying
demand.
towns,
The
5
next two
years can
towns weren't
entrench
designed to
decline so
absorb
deeply
external
that
capital at
recovery
scale,
becomes
and that's
exponentially
exactly
harder.
why the shift
That's
feels
why broad
sharper.
advice like
Morganton,
just
North
wait for
Carolina,
prices to
the
bottom
foothill
fails
town
so
that
badly
became a
here.
pressure valve.
Bottoms aren't universal.
Morganton sits
They're
in the
local.
foothills
And
of
by
the
the
Blue
time a
Ridge
bottom is
Mountains,
obvious,
not far
opportunity
from
is usually
Asheville,
gone
but
or risk
historically
is already
operating
baked
at a
in.
different
The
economic
real
tempo.
takeaway is that
Its
this
population
divide isn't
stands around
theoretical. It
17,000
affects real
inches,
money,
recent estimates,
real
and
mobility,
Burke County
and real
has seen
quality of
modest
life.
but steady growth
Understanding
over the
how
past
prices
decade.
behave,
What
how
changed
buyers
wasn't
act, and how
explosive
outcomes
population
compound
gains
over
inside the
time
city
is the
limits.
difference
It
between
was
being
housing
positioned
demand from
and being
buyers
stuck.
priced out of
And in
neighboring
West
mountain
Virginia,
clubs.
that difference
During the
grows
post,
every year you wait
2020
without
housing
understanding which
expansion,
side of the
North
divide
Carolina
you're on.
consistently ranked among states with strong inbound domestic migration, and Western North Carolina felt the impact. Morganton's median home values, which once hovered near $150,000, $180,000 in the mid-2010s, climbed above $250,000, $300,000 in recent years, depending on neighborhood and property type. That jump might not sound dramatic compared to Western states, but relative to local wages, it represents meaningful compression. Morganton's economy is anchored by healthcare, light manufacturing, and small business activity. Median household income levels have not doubled over the last decade. Housing values, in many cases, have. That gap changes who can participate in ownership. It also reshapes rental markets as single-family homes convert to investor-owned properties. The lived experience in Morganton now carries subtle contrasts. Downtown revitalization efforts brought breweries and art spaces. Trails and nearby Lake James add outdoor appeal. But as more remote workers arrive from Charlotte, Raleigh, or out-of-state metros, the town feels slightly more competitive than it did 5 years ago. Conversations about zoning density and workforce housing are becoming more common. And here's the irony. Many new residents describe Morganton as still affordable, while longtime locals describe it as not what it used to cost. Both statements can be true at the same time. That duality defines the modern small-town migration era. Prescott Valley, Arizona, the spillover that became its own market. Just east of Prescott lies Prescott Valley, a town that historically functioned as a more affordable residential alternative within Yavapai County. Recent population estimates place it above 48,000 residents, reflecting substantial growth from the 2010 census count of roughly 38,000. That's more than 25% growth over the decade. And unlike tourist-heavy Prescott, Prescott Valley developed as a more suburban-style housing market with larger tracts of buildable land. During Arizona's post-2020 migration wave, when the state ranked high for inbound domestic moves, Prescott Valley experienced significant demand. Median home values that once sat comfortably in the low to mid $200,000 range climbed toward and beyond $400,000 during peak activity. Again, relative affordability compared to Phoenix or out-of-state metros made the town attractive, but relative doesn't mean immune. The growth placed strain on infrastructure, roads, schools, and water planning in a drought-sensitive state. The emotional environment feels transitional. Some residents celebrate rising equity and retail expansion. Others quietly worry about whether expansion outpaces community identity. Prescott Valley wasn't marketed as a charming historic mountain town.
When you're talking about
it
the
was
best cities to
practical,
invest in
and
across
practicality
West Virginia in
became its selling
2026,
point.
you can't
Buyers
start
who
anywhere
couldn't
else
secure
except
homes in
Charleston,
Prescott turned
because
east.
even though
Builders
a lot of people look
responded.
at Charleston and assume
Development
it's an old government
accelerated.
town with declining population,
Yet when housing
that's actually
appreciation
why
outpaces
investors
local
are
income
quietly
growth,
jumping in right
the
now.
affordability
Prices
window
are still
narrows quickly.
ridiculously affordable
And the sarcastic
compared to
undertone
similar
writes
sized
itself.
cities.
People move
Demand
seeking
for
elbow
updated
room,
rentals
then
is
debate lot
growing,
sizes at city
and
council
young
meetings.
professionals are
But the
slowly
appeal
coming back
remains durable
because
mountain
remote
views
work
at a
and
lower entry
hybrid
price
jobs
than
make it
flagship
easier to
Western
live somewhere
markets,
peaceful
moderate property
without giving up
taxes
career
compared to several
opportunities.
coastal states,
Charleston has that
and
perfect
growing
in-between
healthcare
vibe.
and retail
It's not
infrastructure.
too big, not too
Prescott
small.
Valley
It still
didn't
has
become a
everything
symbol.
people need.
It became a
Hospitals,
solution.
universities, state
And
offices,
solutions
businesses,
attract attention.
entertainment,
Together,
walkable neighborhoods,
Morganton and
and plenty
Prescott
of
Valley
older homes
illustrate
that
the
are
fourth
perfect for
stage of
renovation.
migration pressure.
Investors
Secondary
can still find
markets
single-family
absorbing
homes
displaced
under
demand.
market value,
These towns didn't
multi-unit
headline
buildings that
national
cash
lists
flow
at first.
immediately,
They
and
benefited from
entire
proximity
blocks
to
where
Asheville in
long-term
one case,
appreciation
to
is
Prescott in
almost
the other.
guaranteed
But once primary markets
revitalization
tighten,
projects keep
buyers
expanding.
scan the map outward
And the
in
best
concentric
part,
circles.
Charleston attracts
And
a
those
different
circles
kind of
eventually
renter,
land
stable
on towns
professionals,
that feel
government
undervalued
workers,
relative
healthcare
to their
employees.
neighbors.
Remote
The pattern
workers,
is
meaning
consistent.
turnover is lower,
State-level
and rental
inbound
income stays
migration
consistent.
strengthens.
Now
Housing
slide
supply
over to
tightens
Huntington,
in core cities.
a city that has been
Surrounding
rebuilding its
communities
reputation
experience
step
price
by step
acceleration.
and is honestly
Local
becoming
wages
one of
struggle
the
to
smartest
match
places
appreciation.
to buy real estate in the
Infrastructure
state.
planning attempts to
Huntington
catch
is home
up.
to Marshall
The
University,
tension isn't
a
explosive,
massive hospital
but it's
network,
cumulative.
a growing downtown,
And cumulative
and a
pressure
steady
changes
flow of
markets
students,
faster
medical
than people
workers,
expect.
and young families
What
looking
makes
for
this
affordable
stage
housing.
different is
The
perception.
university
In
alone
headline towns,
guarantees constant
residents
rental
expect
demand,
growth.
but
In
Huntington
secondary
also has
towns,
something bigger
growth
going on.
feels more abrupt
finally
because identity
investing
was
in its
never tied to
infrastructure,
national visibility.
downtown development,
That's when the
small
emotional
businesses,
impact
and
intensifies.
riverfront improvements.
Teachers talk
Investors
about
love
longer
Huntington because
commutes.
they can still buy
Small
at
business
entry-level
owners
pricing
adjust
and
pricing.
slowly watch
Longtime
appreciation
homeowners
rise as the
debate
city
whether to
continues
cash
its
out.
comeback.
Yet,
A lot
even
of
as
older
these tensions
properties are being
surface,
renovated
the
right now,
inbound movement
which
doesn't
means
stop
neighborhoods
because
that used to
compared
be
to where many
ignored
buyers are coming
suddenly on
from,
investors'
these
radar.
towns still
And
represent
Huntington has an
opportunity.
X factor
But
that people don't
here's
talk
where
about
it gets
enough.
sharper.
The city is
The next
becoming a
towns on
hub
this
for
list
medical professionals
aren't just
from
absorbing
nearby regions,
spillover. They're
which creates
actively
long-term
redefining
housing
themselves
demand
to attract it.
that doesn't disappear
They're
when
investing,
students
marketing,
leave for
positioning
summer.
for growth.
But the
And
heavyweight
when a
city
town
for
starts
investing,
leaning
no
into
surprise,
migration
is
rather than
Morgantown.
reacting to it,
Because
the
Morgantown
stakes
is just
escalate.
one of those markets
That's where we're
that
heading
stays
next.
strong no matter
Here's
what
where the
the
tone
rest of
shifts
the
again
economy is
because
doing.
the next
When the
towns on this
economy is
list
good,
aren't accidental
Morgantown rises.
beneficiaries of
When the
migration
economy
pressure.
slows,
They didn't just
Morgantown
sit
stays
quietly while
And
buyers
the reason is
discovered
simple.
them. They
West
leaned
Virginia
in.
University
They
keeps the city
invested.
alive
They
year-round.
rebranded. They
Students
positioned
bring
themselves
rental
as
demand.
alternatives to larger,
Professors bring
more
stability.
expensive hubs.
Hospitals
And
bring
when a
workforce
town
housing.
intentionally
Tech and energy
positions for
companies
growth,
bring young
the economic
professionals.
acceleration
And remote
feels
workers
sharper,
bring even
and
more
the
diversity
consequences
into the
feel more
market.
immediate.
Morgantown is
Greenville,
big enough to feel
Maine,
like a city.
when wilderness
Small
becomes
enough
a
to feel
selling point.
comfortable,
Greenville
and active
sits
enough to
along the
guarantee
southern
that
tip of
every type
Moosehead
of
Lake,
rental,
surrounded by
single-family,
some of the most
duplex,
dramatic wilderness in the
townhouse,
Northeast.
student
The
housing,
town's permanent population
short-term
is
rental
small,
stays profitable.
under 2,000 residents in
Appreciation is strong
recent
here
census
because the city
estimates,
keeps
but
growing
Piscataquis
outward,
County saw
and new
noticeable
construction keeps
migration
coming.
upticks during
Homes
and
near
after
downtown,
2020
Sunnyside,
as remote
South
work
Park,
opened.
and the campus area
Geographic
are golden
flexibility.
for rentals.
Median home
Meanwhile,
values in
land on
rural
the
Maine
outskirts is
communities,
perfect for
including
longer-term
areas around
development.
Moosehead Lake,
Morgantown isn't
rose
just a strong city in
significantly
West
from
Virginia, it is
mid
genuinely one of the safest
2010
real estate
levels
investments
near
in the entire
$150,000 to
Charleston gives you
$180,000
and
to prices
long-term
exceeding
stability.
$250,000,
revitalization and
$300,000
diverse
for
rental
many
demand.
properties
And
by
Morgantown gives you growth,
2023,
consistency, and
2024,
nonstop
depending
activity.
on waterfront
Together,
access.
they show
That's not
exactly
coastal Maine
why
pricing,
West Virginia
but for a
cities are
historically
becoming
remote
real
interior
contenders
town,
for
it represents
2026
meaningful
investors
acceleration.
who want value
Maine
and
ranked among
upside.
states experiencing
Next,
strong
let's talk
inbound
about three
domestic
cities
migration
that are
during
rising
peak
fast,
remote work
some
years,
in ways
and
people
smaller
expect,
towns like
and some
Greenville
in ways
absorb
that will
part of
shock
that
you,
shift.
starting with
The appeal
Martinsburg,
is obvious,
which honestly feels
expansive
like
forests,
it's on a
lake
completely
access,
different trajectory
low
than the
population
rest of the
density,
state.
and a slower
Martinsburg
pace
is part
of
of
life.
the Eastern
But
Panhandle,
here's the
meaning it
systemic
sits
tension
close
the
to
local
Maryland,
economy has
Virginia,
long been
and
tied to
Washington,
to seasonal
D.C.
tourism and
This is
small-scale
where West
service
Virginia
industries.
affordability meets
Median
big
household
city
incomes in
salaries.
the region have
And
not
that
grown at the
combination
same rate
makes
as property
Martinsburg
values.
one of the strongest
That creates a housing
appreciation markets
affordability
in the
challenge
state.
for year-round workers.
Tons of remote workers,
The lived experience in
commuters,
Greenville now
retirees,
includes
and young
more
families
renovated
are
cabins,
leaving
more
overpriced
year-round
cities
residents
and
where
planting
seasonal
roots in
occupancy
Martinsburg
once
because they get
dominated,
the same
and more
access to
competition
jobs
for
while
lakefront
enjoying lower
inventory.
taxes,
Infrastructure
costs,
in rural
and
towns,
more
healthcare
space.
access, broadband
Investors love
expansion,
Martinsburg because
road
demand
maintenance
stays high,
must stretch further per
inventory
capita
stays
than in
tight,
dense cities.
and renovated
Yet,
homes
for
sell
many
or
inbound
rent
residents,
immediately.
the trade-off feels
You can
worth
buy
it.
a house here,
Lower
fix
overall
it up,
property
and
tax
attract
burdens than
renters who work
several
in
northeastern
DC,
states,
but want a
natural beauty
peaceful,
without high-density
affordable home life.
congestion,
Then you've
and
got
the
Wheeling,
psychological
which is
appeal
having
of
one of
distance
the
from
quietest but
metropolitan
most
pressure.
impressive comebacks
The dark humor,
in West Virginia
people
real
move
estate.
to the woods
For
for
years,
isolation
Wheeling
and then
had that
complain about
old
spotty cell
industrial city
service,
label,
forgetting that the
but now it's
isolation was the
transforming
point.
new businesses,
Greenville shows
new
how even
breweries,
deeply
updated
rural
riverfront
towns are no
areas,
longer insulated
renovated
from
lofts,
national housing
restored
dynamics
Victorian
once
homes,
remote income
and
enters the
community
picture.
investment that
Branson,
actually
Missouri,
feels genuine
entertainment
instead
town
of
meets
corporate.
retirement
Wheeling
migration.
is perfect for investors
Branson
who
has
want to
long
grab
been known as a
undervalued
regional
properties in
entertainment
neighborhoods
destination
that
in
will
the
look
Ozarks,
completely
but it's
different in the
also
next 5 to
experienced
10 years.
steady
The
population growth
architecture is
and
stunning,
housing market
the renovation
acceleration in
potential is
recent years.
massive, and
The
cost
city's
of entry
population
is
sits near
still
12,000
surprisingly low.
inches recent estimates,
Plus,
with
Wheeling
Taney
sits
County
near
growing
Ohio
consistently
and
over the past
Pennsylvania,
decade.
meaning
Median
people
home
from
values in
surrounding
Branson,
states are
which
starting to
hovered
see it
near
as an
or below
escape from higher
$200,000
costs.
in the
Rental
mid-2010s,
demand is
climbed
rising
toward
from young couples,
$300,000 or
remote
more
workers,
by
and
2024
older residents
inches
looking
to
for
many
stable
neighborhoods.
housing near medical centers.
Compared to coastal
Wheeling
markets,
is basically
those
what
prices
future
still
appreciation
appear
investors
modest.
dream about a
That
city with
relative
character,
affordability
history,
is a
cheap real
powerful
estate,
magnet.
and genuine momentum.
Missouri consistently
Now,
ranks
let's
with
talk about the
moderate
sleeper
property
city
tax burdens
almost no one
compared to
mentions,
several
but
high-tax
absolutely
states.
should.
And
Parkersburg.
Branson's combination
This
of
city
lake
sits along
access,
the Ohio
rolling
River
hills,
and has a quiet
and
but
built-in
active
entertainment
economy,
infrastructure
great
attracts
medical
both
centers,
retirees and
very
remote
stable
professionals
housing demand.
seeking lower cost of living.
Parkersburg is one of those
The
places
economic
where homes
base
are still
includes tourism,
extremely affordable,
live
but
entertainment,
rents are stable, and
healthcare
vacancy
services,
rates stay
and
low.
small business operations.
It's the perfect market
But
for investors
migration
who want
changes
consistent
the
cash flow
equation.
without dramatic
As
swings.
new residents arrive
And
with
the real
pensions,
gem in
remote
Parkersburg
salaries,
is the
or
multifamily
equity from
market.
home sales
Duplexes,
elsewhere,
triplexes,
housing demand
and
rises
small
faster than
apartment
local
buildings
income
are
growth.
still priced low
Builders
compared to other
respond
states,
with new
making it
subdivisions,
ideal
but
for
development
investors who want to
requires
scale.
expanded roads,
Parkersburg
schools,
is also attracting
and
retirees
utilities.
who want
The
river
lived
views and
experience
quiet
in
neighborhoods
Branson
without
today
paying big
feels
city
like a
taxes.
blend of resort
The
energy
downtown area has
and
been slowly
permanent relocation.
revitalizing, and
Summer
locals have
traffic
been
remains
investing in
intense,
older
yet
buildings,
more
which
houses
is
are
always a good
occupied
sign for
year-round than in
long-term
decades
appreciation.
past.
What
Local
ties
debates center on
Martinsburg,
growth
Wheeling,
management
and Parkersburg
rather than
together is
survival.
simple. Each
And
city
here's the
offers a
subtle
different
shift.
kind of
What was
growth.
once marketed
Martinsburg gives you
primarily as a
commuter
vacation
growth,
town now
Wheeling gives
functions
you
as a
revitalization
relocation
growth,
town. The
and
humor
Parkersburg
writes
gives you
itself.
stable,
People move for peace
long-term,
and then
low-risk
realize they
cash
live
flow.
near live theater
Investors who
marquees
diversify
and
across
seasonal
these three
crowds.
cities
But
basically
beneath
cover every
the
type of
entertainment
growth market
branding
West
lies
Virginia
something
has to
more
offer in
strategic. A
2026.
town positioned within
And
driving
finally,
distance
if you
of
want the cities
major
that round out
Midwestern
West
metros,
Virginia's
offering
2026
significantly
investment map,
lower
the
housing
ones that give
costs
you
than
balanced
Chicago or
portfolios,
Dallas
low entry
suburbs,
prices,
with
and
scenic
future
terrain
upside,
as
you
a
have to look at
bonus.
Fairmont,
Greenville and Branson
Clarksburg,
illustrate
and
a
Bluefield,
different migration layer
plus
than
one
earlier
bonus
entries.
category
One
that
is
honestly
deeply rural
might be the
and wilderness
smartest
driven.
long-term play
The other
in the
is a
entire
built
state.
entertainment hub
Cities
in the
with
Ozarks.
land opportunities
Yet
surrounding
both
them.
share structural
Let's start with
similarities.
Fairmont,
Population
which sits in
gains
this
tied to
perfect
remote
position
flexibility
between
and retirement
Morgantown and Bridgeport,
migration,
two of the
median
strongest
home
economies
values
in the
rising
northern half of the
significantly
state.
compared to
Fairmont gives you access to
mid-2010
both
baselines,
markets while
and
staying
local
far
economies
more
adapting to
affordable.
residents
The city
whose
has
income sources
universities,
extend beyond
hospitals,
town borders.
parks,
In both
new
cases,
housing
housing
developments,
appreciation
and renters who want
outpaces
something
traditional
quieter
wage growth.
and cheaper than
In
Morgantown,
both
but
cases,
still
infrastructure
close enough
planning
for
must
work or
catch up to
school.
population changes.
Fairmont is also one
and in
of
both
the most
cases,
balanced
the
investment
emotional
cities.
narrative
It's good for
divides
flips,
between optimism
rentals,
and caution.
single-family homes, small
Some residents
multi-units, and
celebrate
even
economic
long-term land
vitality
holdings.
and increased
Now move
property
down to
values.
Clarksburg,
Others
a city
worry
with a
about
steady
affordability
workforce,
for younger
government presence,
generations and
military
essential
history,
workers.
and local
Here's the
industries
broader
that keep
pattern
rental
emerging.
demand strong.
Migration is not
Clarksburg
confined
isn't
to
a flashy
iconic
market.
mountain cities
It's a
anymore.
dependable one.
It's reaching
The
lake
renters here
towns,
tend to
forest
stay longer,
communities, and
neighborhoods are
entertainment
predictable,
hubs
and
anywhere
prices
that
are low
offer
enough
scenic
that
appeal,
investors can start
plus
small and
comparative
scale quickly.
affordability.
Clarksburg
The national
also
housing
benefits from
surge
the growth
between
happening in
2020
Bridgeport.
and
People priced out of newer
2022
developments
didn't just
often
raise
look
prices
toward
in large
Clarksburg for
metros.
cheaper
It
housing,
redistributed
which
demand
boosts rental
outward in
demand
concentric
even
circles. circles. Remote work
Then you've
didn't
got
eliminate
Bluefield,
geography.
which is
It
honestly
reweighted
one of the
it.
most
And once
underrated
that
comeback
reweighting
cities in West
begins,
Virginia.
towns that once
Bluefield
relied
has been
solely on
investing in
seasonal
downtown
tourism
improvements,
or retirement
revitalizing
communities
older
start
buildings,
seeing
and
year-round
encouraging new
population
businesses
shifts.
to come
But
in.
we're not at the
For
top of this
investors,
list yet.
Bluefield
The
is
next
attractive
towns
because
aren't
entry
rural
prices
or
are extremely
entertainment
low.
based.
Flipping is
They
cheap,
sit closer
rental
to major
returns are solid,
metros,
and homes
functioning
move
as
quickly once
hybrid
renovated.
zones close enough for
Bluefield
economic
is also becoming
access,
a retirement
far
friendly
enough
city.
for lifestyle
And with
differentiation,
retirees come long-term
and when
renters,
small towns sit
stable
within
home
commuting
buyers,
distance of
and
booming regions,
consistent
growth
appreciation.
doesn't just
And
trickle,
now we get to the
it
most
compounds.
interesting opportunity.
That's where the pressure
City-adjacent
intensifies
land.
even further.
Cities like
Now we
Elkins,
enter a more strategic
Lewisburg,
phase of this migration
Princeton,
wave.
and
Towns
even
that
parts of
aren't
Charleston
isolated wilderness
have rural
escapes
outskirts
or
with affordable
entertainment hubs,
land,
but
wooded
proximity plays.
acreage, mountain
These are
land,
places close enough to
farmland,
major
and
metropolitan
creekside
economies to
parcels
remain
that
plugged
investors
into
can
job
hold,
networks, yet
develop,
far enough away
or
to offer
turn
lower
into
home
cabin
prices,
rentals.
lower
Land
density,
is becoming the next
and the
wave of
psychological
West Virginia
relief of
investing because
not
people
quite
want
city.
privacy,
This is where
space,
growth becomes less
nature,
about
and
scenery
the ability
alone
to build their
and
own
more
home
about
without
positioning.
insane
And
construction
positioning
costs.
can be powerful.
Rural land around cities
Maryville,
is especially
Tennessee,
valuable
the Smoky
because it
Mountain
offers peace
spillover that
without
keeps
total
climbing.
isolation.
Maryville
Renters
sits
and
just
buyers
south
get
of
access to
Knoxville, at the
hospitals,
foothills of the
grocery
Great
stores,
Smoky
and
Mountains,
jobs while
and its
still
appeal
living in
lies in
nature.
balance.
And here's why
It's
this
close
matters.
enough to Knoxville's
As
job
more
market
people
and
move to
airport
West
to
Virginia
maintain
for
economic
affordability,
connectivity,
the
yet
cities will
distinct
grow
enough to
outward,
market small-town
and those
identity.
outskirts will
The
appreciate
city's
the
population
fastest.
has risen steadily,
Cities like Fairmont
exceeding
give you commuter
32,000
momentum,
inches recent estimates,
Clarksburg gives you
while Blount
stability,
County grew by more than
Bluefield gives you
10%
revival
between
potential,
2010
and
and
surrounding land
2020,
gives you long-term
with continued
wealth building.
inbound migration
West
through the
Virginia
early
isn't just a
2020s.
cheap market,
Tennessee
it's
has
an
consistently
early market.
ranked among
And
states
early markets
experiencing
always
net
reward the
domestic
investors
migration
who see
gains,
the opportunity
particularly
before
during the
everyone else.
2020-2022 relocation surge. That broader state-level inflow rippled outward into towns like Maryville. Median home values that once hovered in the low $200, 0S in the mid-2010s, climbed toward and beyond $350,000, $400,000 by 2024, depending on neighborhood. That appreciation is significant for a foothill community historically viewed as affordable. Tennessee's lack of a state income tax remains a strong draw for retirees and remote earners. And when you combine tax structure with mountain access and suburban level amenities, the result is sustained demand. But sustained demand shifts expectations. Starter homes sell faster, new subdivisions expand toward the county's outer edges, school enrollment forecasts become more complicated. And while median household incomes in the region have risen, they haven't kept pace with peak housing acceleration during the hottest market years. The lived experience in Maryville feels optimistic, but aware. Residents appreciate retail growth and job stability near Knoxville, yet many also notice heavier traffic along commuter corridors. The town still offers mountain views and relative affordability compared to large metros, but the pricing gap is narrowing. The dark humor writes itself. People move to escape suburban sprawl and then approve another subdivision at the planning meeting. Yet for families comparing mortgage payments in Nashville or Atlanta to those in Maryville, the choice often feels rational. That's the quiet power of proximity. You don't sacrifice opportunity, you adjust location. Castle Rock, Colorado, between two economic engines. Castle Rock sits between Denver and Colorado Springs, and that geography alone explains much of its growth story. The town's population has surpassed 80,000 inches recent estimates, and Douglas County grew by roughly 16% between 2010 and 2020. Unlike isolated mountain towns, Castle Rock functions as a commuter-friendly hub positioned between two major employment centers. During the national housing acceleration from 2020 to 2022, Colorado experienced strong inbound and internal migration patterns, and communities within driving distance of Denver absorbed significant demand. Median home values in Castle Rock, which hovered in the mid-$400,000 range in the mid-2010s, climbed well above $600,000 during peak housing cycles. That kind of appreciation doesn't go unnoticed. Yet relative to Denver's urban core, Castle Rock often remains somewhat more attainable for families seeking larger homes and suburban layouts with mountain views as backdrop. The economic base includes commuting professionals, retail expansion, and local service industries. But when housing costs rise faster than wage growth in local service sectors, the affordability equation tightens. Castle Rock's appeal is pragmatic: scenic foothill landscapes without full mountain isolation, access to metro jobs without full metro density. Living there today feels like inhabiting a transition zone. New construction, communities expanding rapidly, retail corridors growing, school districts scaling. Infrastructure investment has kept pace more effectively than in some smaller towns, but growth always outpaces planning by at least a step. The emotional undertone in Castle Rock is less about identity preservation and more about growth management. Residents expect expansion. The debate centers on how much and how fast. And here's the irony. People often describe Castle Rock as offering space, yet it is precisely its position between two growing metros that ensures space will keep shrinking over time. That's not pessimism, that's geometry. Maryville and Castle Rock represent a different migration tier, commuter-adjacent towns benefiting from economic gravity while still offering lower perceived cost than nearby metros. Both saw double-digit county growth over the past decade. Both experienced meaningful median home value increases between 2015 and 2024. Both continue attracting households recalculating where they can get the most square footage per dollar without severing access to job markets. And both face the same structural reality. Housing markets adjust faster than income baselines. The pattern is clear now. Early in this list, we saw wilderness and tourism towns absorb remote income. Then, secondary spillover markets tightened. Now we're watching proximity towns accelerate. Each layer of migration shifts further down the housing affordability ladder while maintaining economic connectivity. And here's where it intensifies, because the final tier of this countdown includes towns that aren't just growing steadily or positioning strategically, they are experiencing transformation at a pace that fundamentally alters their trajectory. And when growth becomes transformation, the stakes aren't just economic, they're cultural. Now we reach the final tier, not just towns that are growing, not just places benefiting from proximity, but communities undergoing identity transformation in real time. These aren't quiet absorption markets anymore. These are towns that have crossed a psychological threshold. When you mention them in conversation, people nod. They've heard of them. They've considered them. And once a town enters that stage, migration isn't just steady, it compounds. New Braunfels, Texas, the Hill Country recalibration. New Braunfels sits between Austin and San Antonio, anchored in Texas Hill Country with river access, historic charm, and direct highway connectivity to two major metro economies. Its population has exploded over the past decade, surpassing 100,000 inches recent estimates after growing by more than 56% between 2010 and 2020. That growth rate places it among the fastest growing cities in the country during that period. And it didn't stop there. Texas consistently ranked among top inbound migration states throughout the early 2020s, and New Braunfels absorbed a significant share of that inflow. Median home values that once hovered near $200,000 in the mid-2010s climbed well beyond $350,000, $400,000 by 2024, with some neighborhoods exceeding that depending on new development phases. What makes New Braunfels different is scale. This isn't a 10,000 person mountain enclave trying to hold on to its charm. This is a mid-sized city doubling down on expansion while trying to preserve its German-rooted historic identity. The economy benefits from its corridor location between Austin's tech growth and San Antonio's diversified base. Remote workers from California and other high-cost states began arriving during the 2022 housing surge, often bringing substantial equity from previous home sales. Texas's lack of state income tax added another financial incentive, but scale creates friction. Rapid subdivision construction pushes outward. Road infrastructure strains under commuter volumes. Water resource planning becomes a long-term concern in a drought-sensitive state. The emotional atmosphere feels energetic but stretched. New residents talk about opportunity and affordability relative to Austin. Longtime residents talk about traffic patterns that didn't exist a decade ago. The humor is almost predictable. People leave Austin to escape congestion, then sit on I-35 during peak hours. Yet the appeal remains powerful because compared to many coastal metros, the housing-to-income ratio still feels workable for incoming buyers. New Braunfels demonstrates what happens when a small town evolves into a strategic economic satellite. Daho Falls, Idaho, the undervalued mountain base camp. Idaho Falls rarely makes national relocation headlines the way Boise does, but that's precisely why its growth story matters. Bonneville County experienced steady population growth over the past decade, and Idaho Falls itself has climbed past 65,000 residents in recent estimates. Idaho ranked at or near the top of inbound migration metrics during 2021 and 2022. And while much of that spotlight hit the Boise metro area, eastern Idaho quietly gained traction as affordability tightened elsewhere in the state. Median home values in Idaho Falls that once hovered near $180,000, $200,000 in the mid-2010s rose toward $350,000, $400,000 during peak, housing years before moderating slightly. That appreciation reflects not just local economic change, but statewide demand pressure. Idaho Falls benefits from proximity to outdoor recreation, national parks within driving distance, and a diversified economic base including healthcare, energy-related research facilities, and regional services. What differentiates it from earlier entries is its role as a value alternative within a state that itself became a migration magnet. When Boise prices climbed rapidly after 2020, buyers looked east. The spillover wasn't dramatic overnight. It was incremental, then noticeable, then structural. The lived experience in Idaho Falls feels transitional. There's visible new construction. There's a sense of optimism about retail and healthcare expansion. But there's also awareness that wages tied to local industries don't necessarily match the purchasing power of inbound remote earners. Infrastructure conversations now center on sustainable growth rather than economic survival. The dark humor here is subtle. People searching for Idaho's last affordable pocket may find themselves competing with others doing the exact same calculation. Idaho Falls isn't flashy. It's practical, and practicality is often more durable than trendiness. New Braunfels and Idaho Falls reveal the final pre-top stage of this migration arc: scale and substitution. One is a corridor city turning into a regional anchor. The other is a secondary state market absorbing overflow from a national hotspot. Both experienced strong population growth between 2010 and 2020. Both saw median home values rise sharply during 2022-2022. Both reflect the broader shift toward geographic arbitrage earned from one economy, live in another. But now we arrive at the very top of this countdown, the town that doesn't just symbolize migration, but encapsulates the full contradiction of modern small-town relocation. It's beautiful, it's desirable, it's growing, and it's already wrestling with the question every town on this list eventually faces. How do you stay small when everyone wants in? And here we are, the top of the list. The town that doesn't just illustrate migration, but embodies the contradiction at the center of this entire movement. Because this isn't a sleepy place that accidentally trended. It's a small, beautiful town that became a national relocation target, and once that happens, there's no going back to obscurity. Georgetown, Texas, the polite growth that changed everything. Georgetown sits just north of Austin, in the rolling terrain of Central Texas, and over the past decade, it has quietly rewritten what small-town expansion looks like. The population has surged dramatically, climbing past 75,000 residents in recent estimates after growing more than 40% between 2010 and 2020. In several recent census releases, Georgetown ranked among the fastest growing cities in the United States for its size category. That isn't organic drift, that's migration velocity. And it accelerated sharply after 2020 when remote work untethered thousands of professionals from traditional office locations, and Texas consistently ranked near the top of inbound domestic migration counts. The appeal checks multiple boxes at once: proximity to Austin's tech economy, no state income tax, master planned communities with new construction inventory, and a historic town square that still looks curated rather than chaotic. But numbers tell the deeper story. Median home values that hovered near $250,000 in the mid-2010s climbed well beyond $400,000. $450,000 during peak 2021-2022 housing cycles, with some new subdivisions exceeding that depending on lot size and build phase. Even with broader national cooling, prices remain elevated compared to pre-pandemic baselines. That appreciation created wealth for early homeowners. It also tightened affordability for teachers, first responders, and service workers tied to local wage scales. And here's the part that matters. Georgetown's growth wasn't just retirees. Yes, the town has long been known for active adult communities. But during the migration surge, mid-career professionals, remote tech employees, and families looking for suburban scale without Austin pricing poured in. When buyers arrive carrying equity from $800,000 or $1 million coastal home sales, the pricing psychology of a smaller market shifts immediately. Offers become stronger, appraisals climb, builders accelerate. Infrastructure planning scrambles to match housing starts. Living in Georgetown today feels optimistic but stretched. New retail corridors expand, school districts grow. Traffic volumes increase on highways connecting to Austin. And while residents praise safety, schools, and community aesthetics, there's an undercurrent of recognition that what once felt comfortably small now feels transitional. The humor is dry but real. People move to escape Austin congestion and then debate roundabout construction timelines at local council meetings. Georgetown represents the full life cycle of modern small-town migration. First comes rediscovery. People notice it's cheaper than Austin. Then comes acceleration, double-digit growth rates, and rising home prices. Then comes normalization, national recognition, developer expansion, and long-term infrastructure planning. And finally comes the identity question. How do you preserve a town's character when its population grows faster than its original blueprint? Georgetown's property tax structure, while lower than some high-tax states, still reflects Texas's reliance on property revenue. As home valuations increase, so do tax bills, even if rates remain stable. Insurance premiums fluctuate alongside regional construction and climate factors. School bonds appear on ballots to fund expansion. These are not dramatic crises. They're structural adjustments. But structural adjustments shape daily life more than headlines do. Emotionally, Georgetown feels aspirational. Residents speak of opportunity, space, and relative affordability compared to major metros. But affordability is relative, not absolute. A $400,000, $500,000 median home price may feel reasonable compared to San Jose or Seattle, yet it feels very different to someone who remembers when the same house cost half as much. That dual reality defines the migration era. Some residents feel like they arrived early, others feel like they arrived just in time, and those trying to enter now wonder if they're already late. What makes Georgetown the top entry on this list isn't just population growth, it's the complete arc. It shows how remote work, tax policy, metro spillover, and lifestyle branding converge. It shows how infrastructure planning becomes a permanent conversation rather than a reactive one. And it shows how small-town identity evolves under sustained demand. Step back and look at all 15 towns we've covered across this series. From lakeside communities to mountain hubs, from foothill spillovers to corridor satellites, the pattern is undeniable. Population growth between 2010 and 2020 accelerated in many of these places. Median home values rose sharply between 2020 and 2022. States with lower tax burdens or outdoor lifestyle appeal consistently ranked high for inbound migration. Remote work removed geographic constraints. Equity from higher-priced markets flowed into smaller ones. And once that capital entered, pricing recalibrated. The migration wave isn't random. It's layered. First, the iconic towns surge. Then their neighbors absorb pressure. Then secondary markets reprice. Then proximity towns expand. And eventually, even the places once considered undiscovered become known quantities. Here's the uncomfortable truth that sits beneath all 15 entries. Beauty attracts attention. Attention attracts capital. Capital reshapes affordability, and affordability determines who can stay. That cycle doesn't make these towns worse. It makes them different. Some residents celebrate rising equity and economic vitality. Others worry about generational displacement and infrastructure strain. Both reactions are valid because both reflect lived reality. Be honest. If you could reduce your overall cost of living compared to a larger metro, gain access to nature or walkable downtown charm, and still maintain income flexibility, would you consider it? That's the quiet calculation driving this movement. It's not panic, it's optimization. But optimization doesn't pause to protect nostalgia. Small towns across America are no longer invisible. They're being evaluated, compared, and strategically selected. And once a town becomes part of that national conversation, it rarely returns to obscurity. Some will manage growth with careful planning. Others will feel strain more acutely. But none of them are immune to the arithmetic that sparked this shift in the first place. The question isn't whether Americans will keep moving to small, beautiful towns. The question is how many of those towns can stay beautiful and affordable once everyone realizes the math works.